Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question of doom is actually a response to a question that I've received many times over the years, and until now I haven't really known how to go about trying to answer this on video. But as the title has already told you, it's to do with whether or not Vikings had horns on their helmets, specifically for battle, to inspire terror in their enemies. The reason why I'm answering this question now actually is because a couple of days ago I was having a conversation with a policeman about his conical black policeman's helmet. It's a classic image, beamed all around the world. Everyone more or less knows what a British bobby looks like. And we're talking about the use of that hat, of that helmet, and how functional it is, how functional it used to be. And he said, well, it would be much more intimidating if it had horns on the helmet, wouldn't it? Just like the Vikings. And I just thought, maybe this is the time to try and answer this question, because we went on to have a good conversation about this idea, horns on helmets, especially amongst the Vikings. Now, there's a very conclusive archaeological answer to this question, and we will come to that. But I suppose first of all it's worthwhile briefly exploring the idea of horns on helmets and the Vikings. Where does it come from? Well, there is a prevalent myth around, and unfortunately I actually can't find evidence of this particular myth. But I've heard it told several times, and that is that early archaeologists, when uncovering the graves of Norsemen, the Danes, other Scandinavian type burials, even obviously burials in Britain, in Ireland, so on and so forth, they would come across these warriors who thought that they were going to Valhalla. And in their mind's eye, they sort of imagined that they'd be fighting all day, drinking all night, having a wonderful time, eating and killing, and never dying. Essentially, there's this sort of ongoing Norse warriors party, theme park, ecstasy land. And with that in mind, they buried themselves with very particular artifacts. For example, things to fight with, so helmet, spear, sword, shield, axe, this kind of thing. And also things to drink out of, namely horns, drinking horns. And the story goes that archaeologists found these drinking horns near to these warriors' heads, and interpreted them as having fallen off the helmet of the warrior, and sort of fallen into this position, even though there's no evidence for fixings to the helmet or other mechanisms to actually have maybe even a multiple use for these horns as drinking horns and attachments to helmets. So apparently this was the interpretation. Sadly, actually, I can't find any evidence though of that, and I think that might be an archaeological myth surrounding the myth of the Vikings with horned helmets. But nonetheless, in the 19th century, the Victorians, who were responsible for our view of so many periods in history, they took this imagery of Vikings with horned helmets and really went to town. And also as well, of course, in other forms of artwork, not just paintings, but also, for example, in opera, Wagner's famous Valkyrie, the fat lady at the end of the opera with the horned helmet. She has entered our psyche as being what an exaggerated Viking looks like, but nonetheless, horns on helmets. Now, some people hold on to this idea really rather tenaciously, as it were. They really have a tenacity when it comes to this notion of horns on helmets, and I suspect this comes from a desire to not have their glorious idea watered down. Whereas I don't think that horns on helmets, or rather not having horns on helmets, waters down the Vikings at all. But nonetheless, some people really do feel strongly about this, and they point to certain evidence to try and back up the notion that Vikings might have had horns on helmets, or probably did in their view. So, for example, the Waterloo or Thames helmet is a very famous Iron Age or Celtic art object recovered from the River Thames in London. It has conical horns on the top. It fitted a man's head around about size 7 in terms of hat size. And as far as we can tell, it's strictly ceremonial. It's not for combat. And horns on heads were sort of linked with the gods, and it was essentially a votive offering to the Thames, to the river, or into the river for or on behalf of the gods. Other people point to evidence from around about that time as well in written form. I mean, the Waterloo helmet is around about 150 BC, I believe. But in written form, you have, for example, Tacitus talking about British people especially, but also hinting at the Roman perception of other groups in Northern Europe as having fur for clothes, perhaps, or sort of regalia on the head, which could be seen as that classic Viking image, which people really want to try and prove existed. But there is a problem here, and the problem really is the fact that you're looking at essentially Roman sources to talk about a period which is long after the Roman period, especially in Britain. This is exactly the same as looking at, I don't know, the high medieval era in Europe and trying to learn about the First World War. It's not going to work. It's simply too far apart. There may be similarities in terms of cultural attitude. For example, I don't know, the prevalence of the church in both of those periods. But the clothing and the attitudes to clothing, what clothing meant, there's an ongoing evolution of those ideas. It changes over time. So I don't think that evidence really holds up under scrutiny. There are, though, accounts, for example, from Byzantium of the Varangi Guard, the Varangian, or sort of, I suppose, the Rus and the Varangi, who went down to Constantinople, and some were hired as bodyguards, essentially, for the emperor type figure. There's accounts of them dressing up very elaborately for ceremonies, for sort of religious purposes. And again, it doesn't directly tell us about necessarily horns on helmets, but that is pointed to as evidence of the potential for this practice. Now, that said, though, there's also some very good descriptions of these Norsemen in everyday life from Byzantine and people from Constantinople, historians essentially, observing them. And they don't mention horns on helmets. They mention fancy clothes, they mention an axe on the belt, baggy trousers, finely kept beard and hair, but nothing about horns on helmets. So again, even the evidence that points to this ceremonial regalia, this sense of the dramatic in ceremonies, in religious life, in terms of battle and certainly in terms of everyday dress, there's no actual evidence for it. There's also actually no archaeological evidence for this. Not a single helmet has been found with attachments for horns, or indeed with horns on the helmet, from the Viking period for battle. Now, there are lots of other types of Viking helmet which have been discovered, some of them really rather elaborate, these sort of things that have these elaborate forms around the eyes and on the nose, these very intimidating helmets, but nothing with horns. That said, though, while I was doing some additional research for this video, I did come across a wonderful April Fool's article written about a Viking horned helmet having been discovered, and I'll put a link to that in the video information below, so do check that out. That was wonderful, in 2009, I believe. Anyway, so that we talked a little bit about these ideas and about the evidence and whether or not that evidence holds up, and I don't think it does hold up. Now let's just think about the mechanics. This helmet is designed for a very specific purpose. The shape of the helmet is actually designed to dispel knives and knives, axes, and other things that might come at the helmet away from the head. So if something hits the helmet, it is immediately cast away from the helmet, like that. And this is because of this conical shape with the point on top. If you go along with the idea of horns on helmets, I have a blowing horn and a drinking horn here, there are a couple of things that actually change about the helmet. First of all, the impression that one gets from someone wearing this helmet. This individual immediately actually looks rather comical. Actual 2-scale cow horns on the side of your head do actually look rather stupid, to be honest. They look a bit silly. But beyond that, immediately, what you're doing if you do put horns on your helmet is you are counteracting, you're negating the purpose of the helmet, and that is to stop things hitting you on the head. So I could miss this helmet by a mile and still have the knife directed back into the head, making the helmet dangerous, actually making it more dangerous than it otherwise would be. In other words, horns on helmets actually make the helmet pointless. They make the helmet attract danger instead of rebuffing danger. Also as well, horns on the helmet are a very handy handle. You can grab the helmet, maybe break the person's neck, the person who's wearing the helmet, and of course you can't sneak up on someone if you've got horns on your helmet, which is again kind of counter to that traditional Viking raiding tactic of being able to quietly come in on a ship, on a river, and then have a raiding party. Horns on helmets don't make sense. And as we've already talked about, they're actually for drinking out of. They're effectively party cups for the most part, unless they're flat bottomed. But this kind of thing, you can't put it down, so you have to share it around in order to drink your mead and to share it with others. So in some ways, putting horns on your helmet is kind of like actually putting pint glasses on your head. Completely pointless, really rather dangerous, and just something that you wouldn't necessarily do. That's all well and good, I can hear you say, but what about the proof, Mr. Soup? Have you got anything that actually shows us that Vikings at the time had pointy helmets, had no horns on their helmets? Well, yes, actually, there's quite a bit of good circumstantial evidence out there. I'll start with a carving from Lindisfarne, which was famously attacked by the Vikings in AD 793. Not a single Viking on that carving has a horn on their helmet, not a single horn on one of their helmets. They all have rounded heads, and they do have interesting shaped eyes, again indicating that elaboration on the helmets, the eye elaboration, but no horns on the helmets. There's also for example, the Lewis chess pieces. There we have several Viking and possibly Saxon warriors showing off essentially in these pieces, even a berserker biting his shield in a spurt of rage. But they all have lovely pointy helmets. They do not have horns on their helmets. Now, other people point to the notion of, for example, wings on helmets. And actually, funnily enough, yesterday, Keith, an Archaeology, sent me this. It's Thor with wings on his helmet. And I thought that's a very timely thing to receive in the post. But wings on helmets, and actually the wings on the helmets, again, this comes from a misunderstanding of the representation of helmets. Some helmets from this period have elaborate cheek guards, essentially flaps on the side of the helmet which rest against the cheek to protect the warrior, and hopefully to try and offer some sort of protection to the face. When not in use, these cheek flaps would actually be folded upwards away from the cheeks and then tied above the head. So the string or the leather which tied it beneath the chin would be used to tie it above the head. So these flaps would be up like that. They look a little bit like wings already. But then when you take certain images which show what appear to be wings on helmets, which unfortunately I actually can't show you an image of one of these carvings for copyright reasons. But when you see them, you go, oh my goodness, there's wings on those helmets. But they're not. They're probably actually cheek guards folded up in between elements of battle, so that you can actually hear what people are saying. You can actually say receive orders or have a bit of a conversation about what you're going to do next, prior to or during a battle. So the cheek guards up may be where the idea of wings on helmets come from. Now that said though, there are, for example, some embellishments which I think are very interesting and in some ways surprising. There is, for example, instances of a boar, a little copper boar, not copper, sorry, brass, I think, boar on top of the helmet, certainly metal. On top of the helmet, which is an elaboration which on the one hand could make the helmet a little bit more likely to be knocked off the head if a blade or something catches the boar, but it's not massive, it's not dramatically changing the shape of the helmet, and I have to say, to my mind, it's quite a nice little embellishment. There are also many other ways in which helmets were embellished. For example, famously the Sutton Hoo helmet has a moustache, has hunting scenes all around it, this kind of thing. So embellishments on helmets did happen, but all I'm saying is that the horns on helmets almost certainly didn't happen in battle, or certainly for the purposes of battle. Now, why does this matter? Why on earth why am I getting so passionate about this question? Well, I'm getting passionate about it because I think it's important not to misrepresent people from the past and not to misrepresent the evidence. Recently, I was giving a teacher training session where a teacher came over after the session and said, "Oh yeah, I've been really inspired by what you said today." I was like, "Oh, thank you." And she was saying, "I really want to use the Vikings next year as one of my topics." I was like, "Oh, excellent." And she said, "But you've got to have horns on the helmet, haven't you? You know, it's just cool. You can't not have horns on the helmet." And I walked her through some of these mechanical issues that I talked about with you just now, and she said, "Well, yeah, but it's not the Vikings without the horns. They've got to have horns on the helmet, haven't they?" And I didn't back down, but I'm fairly sure she left with the idea that horns on helmets had to be taught to children. Now, in this instance, what I always come back to actually is one of my favourite stories, where I remember hearing an adult talking to a child, probably about 8 years old, about dinosaurs, and they said, "Now remember, Stegosaurus, of course. Stegosaurus was a meat eater, yeah." And a little boy stamped his foot and went, No, Stegosaurus is a herbivore. It eats vegetables, Daddy." And I thought, yes, exactly, yes. Well done, little boy. Excuse me. You know what a good fact is, and you're holding on to it. You're not letting a myth take you over. And in that sense, young children, especially, they love to be right about things, and they also love to find out new and exciting ideas, different to what other people assume. And I suppose that's really what my problem is that unless archaeology is challenging our assumptions about the past, actually telling us something new about the past, and actually challenging our preconceptions about what people, for example, wore in the past, what's the point of archaeology or learning history when all you could do is just learn a whole load of stereotypes and cartoon characters from your friends and family, and that's your historical education? History and archaeology exist specifically to challenge these ideas, to ask questions. Did Vikings have horns on helmets? Is there any evidence for that? And the answer is no. There is no evidence for horns on helmets, especially when it comes to the Vikings, and specifically when it comes to combat. When it comes to going into battle, which everyone associates it with, no, there is no evidence. And I passionately believe that archaeology is more than just a mirror, just something which reflects our assumptions about the past back at us. It is, in fact, that which breaks the mirror, that which challenges our assumptions, and that which actually makes our understanding of history richer, and therefore our understanding of ourselves richer and more accurate. Anyway, I've rambled on about this for a while now. I'm sure there'll be many people out there who have different ideas about this question, and all I would say is please do comment below, but please do not get into an argument over the question of Vikings, horns and helmets, or helmets and horns. I look forward to seeing what you have to say, and also look forward to hearing your thoughts on whether or not actually archaeologists should just allow these ideas, these stereotypes to exist. I absolutely love the character of Thor, but he is, after all, a comic book character. He's not an accurate representation of Norse culture. And I can separate the two. There is a place for Thor in my heart, as it were. But there isn't necessarily a place for those two coexisting as a historical truth. And I'd love to hear more ideas about that, about myths about the past. If you have any stories, please do share them. As always, thank you for watching. Do take care. And until next time, bye-bye.